I want to start with acknowledging ExxonMobil, who's funding me, and also want to acknowledge the Iris Data Management Center, which I use to access the waveform data I'm going to show you. And of course, I also want to thank Roel for discussion during this study, and also for support during the last 2 years. I want to show you how I use globally distributed earthquakes to map the local cluster structure beneath a small-scale array. I do this by a line deconvolution approach, which I'm going to outline briefly, and finally I apply this approach to both synthetic and field data. Let's start with, so what is a teleseismic event? A teleseismic event is nothing else but an earthquake which happens far away from the station, and far away implying that the waves arrive with an angle of incidence close to 0. For the frequencies we're looking at, this implies that the epicentral distance is about larger than 25 degrees, and in turn this requires large magnitude, body wave magnitude, larger than 5.5 to be observed at these large distances. The frequency range of the associated body waves is ranging from 0.1 to 2 Hz, which gives us wavelengths ranging from approximately 2 to 50 kilometers. And I want to emphasize that during this study I'm going to show you I'm only dealing with body waves and not with surface waves. So the body waves of these teleseismic events have been used for a long time in global seismology. All these beautiful pictures we know from subduction zones, from plumes, even if they are still highly debated, origin from teleseismic travel time tomography. On a more regional scale, receiver function is quite a popular method to map deeper mantle structures, in particular the crust mantle boundary. However, I posed the question, can we also use these teleseismic earthquakes to map the local structure on a local scale, and by that I mean vertical and horizontal extents of several kilometers. Of course, the question is, why do we want to do this? So, looking at the frequencies, I can never expect to get a high resolution image comparable to reflection seismology. But however, we may get some low resolution, robust image of the shallow crust, maybe also the deeper crust, which might be useful for the low frequency end, to better constrain the low frequency end, which we need for full waveform inversion. And the second thing is, earthquakes are of course an abundant and cheap, strong source of seismic energy occurring over and over and over again. And in particular, the teleseismic events, which are far away, arrive vertically, and it's a plane wave, which makes the considerations I'm going to outline in the next slide very simple. Let's have a look in more detail what happens when a vertically incident plane wave arrives at the surface. I denote this body wave with W, which characterizes a source wavelet which arrives at the surface. And of course, the free surface acts as a kind of a mirror, so the wave gets reflected, bounces into the surface again, gets reflected at reflectors, and comes up to the surface again. And what we actually observe is both the superposition of the incoming source wavelet with its convolution with the reflectivity series. The minus sign origins from the fact that define reflection coefficients in terms of vertical displacement, and I'm using a ray-based coordinate system. So this is just kind of a convention. With this particular geometry, you might think that the surface acts as a kind of a virtual source. And I also want to emphasize, I'm speaking here of a source wavelet, but by that I don't mean the source time signature of the earthquake, but it's actually a source wavelet which arrives at the station. Let's look in more detail what happens if we have a shallow reflector, maybe a basement and a depth of several kilometers, and a low frequency wavelet, for example from a teleseismic earthquake. As I said, we observe both the superposition of the source wavelet and this convolution with the reflectivity series. And even for the simple 1D case, the convolution with the reflectivity series is just a scaled and shifted version of the source wavelet itself. And if you assume realistic reflectivity coefficients, it's of course easy to see that it's very difficult or impossible to directly deduce the arrival time of the reflection in the observed signal due to the superposition. Of course, standard tool to work out the reflected signal is simply to perform deconvolution. However, here we have the problem that due to the superposition, we cannot directly access a good estimate of the source wavelet. So we also have to estimate both the reflectivity series, which is the main interest, and also the source wavelet. And this is the general problem, if you want to call it like this, of blind deconvolution. So blind deconvolution means nothing else but the simultaneous estimation of both the reflectivity series or transfer function and the source wavelet from an observed convolution. If you look at single traces, you might think of the conventional spiking deconvolution as a special case of a blind deconvolution, because we can always get a good guess of the amplitude spectra of the source wavelet by simply taking the autocorrelation of the observed seismic signal and making some assumption on the phase spectra, for example, minimum phase. This minimum phase assumption is, of course, a rather strong assumption, and so already in 1978, Wiggins came up with the so-called minimum entropy deconvolution, which is basically a statistic approach which circumvents this minimum phase assumption but puts some other constraints or assumptions. And if we have multiple traces, there are so-called homomorphic operators, which are based on basically on taking the logarithm of the observed signals, and by taking the logarithm and looking at multiple traces, it can be shown that it's more simple to separate the source wavelet and the reflectivity series. Of course, if you have again multiple traces, multiple recordings, a very hand-on, very practical approach is always simply to estimate the source wavelet by simply averaging the recordings and hoping that the contributions from the individual reflectivity series will cancel out. However, I use stereo seismic events, and I want to apply them on a closely spaced multi-channel recording array. And my main assumption for this method is that the aperture of the array is small in comparison to the wavelength of the incoming wave, which means that I observe the same source wavelet at all stations. So if I have several events, and describe a number n of teleseismic events which are observed in my array, and I have a number of m receivers, and I assume that they observe the same source wavelet or receivers, and each station is characterized by individual reflectivity series. It's quite easy to see that with this configuration we have n plus m unknowns, which is simply the sum of the number of events and the reflectivity series at the receivers. But each event is observed at each receiver, so I have n times m observations. There are of course, some further assumptions for this method, and basically the assumptions are that the reflectors I want to image are sub-horizontal and laterally continuous. Not in terms of the reflectivity coefficient, but in terms that they have to cross the entire array. The reflectivity coefficient can vary. There's of course more detail for this approach in the project review book if you're interested. And if I have this equation system, I can of course solve it by conventional algorithms. And for each inversion, of course, need an objective function. And looking at my model which is set up, which is that the observed recording is the superposition of the source wavelet with the convolution of the reflectivity series. I transform this to the frequency domain. The convolution gets, of course, replaced by the multiplication. And the objective function is then simply the difference of the observed spectra for each frequency node and my model frequency spectra according to my model. I also put some stabilization equations, which are called continuity constraints, to the equation system. Basically, these continuity constraints should enforce the assumption which I mentioned before, that the reflectors have to be continuous. And they, of course, are weighted. So, and again, I want to emphasize with this model, I have n events and m channels, which means I have n times n observations versus m plus m unknowns for each frequency node, and they can then perform this. They can set up an equation system and starting from an initial model. I can work on a solution for both the source wavelets and for the reflectivity series. To give you illustration, I started with a synthetic example. So the synthetic example comprises a 9 km long section populated with 55 receivers. It's set up of 5 layers. All of the layers are horizontal with the exception of the near surface layers, a lower angle fault. And they populate this model with realistic values for shear wave and body wave, and compressional wave velocities, and also for density, calculate the reflectivity coefficients and the reflectivity series. Oh, sorry. It's fine? Thanks. And as I said, I populate this with 55 receivers, and for my modeling, for synthetic modeling, I also of course need source wavelets. I choose 5 teleseismic events or 5 source wavelets, which I inject, if you want, or which I put into my model, and I calculate my synthetic data. So based on the field data, I'm going to show on the later slides. I use a rather limited frequency range of 0.5 to 1.8 Hz for these source wavelets, and the phase spectra is characterized by mixed phase spectra, so it's not minimum phase. As I said, so here I'm showing you the result for the data for the source wavelet, which is now denoted by the rectangle for each receiver. The dashed lines in the data, the synthetic data, show you the expected for the arrival times for the layers in the model, and you can see already here you can see the main problem, which is that the shallow reflections are buried beneath the strong source wavelet, and the deeper reflections due to the weaker impedance contrast are also not detectable in the raw data themselves. I perform, in the next slide, I'm going to show you the result from the blind deconvolution approach, and I also compare it to standard deconvolution, which means I assume a source wavelet from averaging all recordings for each event, perform the deconvolution, and then stack over the 5 events. The results are shown here. So for the blind deconvolution, as I told you before, I need an initial model. The initial model I use for the reflectivity series is 0 reflectivity, so I don't assume any reflectors. And the initial model for the source wavelets are again derived from averaging over all receivers. If you look at the first panel, which shows the result from the blind deconvolution approach, the shallow basement reflector in 4 km depth is maybe visible in the some trust in the right part of the data, and the mid-crustal reflection in approximately 20 km depth is not visible at all, but it has a very low impedance contrast, so it's not surprising. And the reflection from the crust mantle boundary, which you see here at 12 seconds, is actually quite good visible. If I apply these continuity constraints, the picture appears less noisy, which makes sense because, as I said, I want to enforce the lateral continuity. So random noise is not coherent, so it's not included in the model. And the last panel shows the application from the standard deconvolution, which appears overall more noisier. So this is again actually not surprising that the standard deconvolution appears more noisier, because for the main difference between the application of the standard deconvolution and the blind deconvolution is that the blind deconvolution approach asks for a common model for all observations. For the standard deconvolution, I derive a new model for each event. And of course, by stacking over the results, I hope to minimize the influence of noise, but still there's a much stronger influence on the noise. In the last slides now, I'm going to show you the result from the application to a field dataset. So the field dataset is the LaBarge dataset. The LaBarge seismic experiment, seismic project, is a cooperation between ExxonMobil and I think 2 academic institutions, CWP being one of them. And basically it aims at evaluating the feasibility of passive seismology for large-scale subsurface imaging. In this experiments, 55 3-component broadband stations were deployed at a very narrow spacing, so the stations are denoted by the white dots. The station spacing is 250 meters, and they were deployed over an active oil and gas production site, so the subsurface structure is reasonably well known. And I also want to outline the main structural feature in the region is the Hochspeck thrust, which is indicated by the, which you can see on the map. And the Hochspeck thrust indicates a low-angle fault which is dipping to the west and separates higher velocity carbonates in the west from lower clastics in the east regarding the near surface. These instruments were deployed for 7 months. So during the 7 months, there were of course a lot of teleseismic events happen. So in the end, I used 5 teleseismic events, and I'm going to show you the data for 2 of them. So the map of the teleseismic events with respect to the receiver area, you can see in the lower right part. So the first event I'm going to show you is from an earthquake from the tropical paradise of Papua New Guinea, and the second one is from the Kuril Islands in close to Alaska. They use these pictures to separate them. These are the pre-processed field data, meaning the recording for these 2 events of all 55 stations. The stations are simply arranged from the west to the east. And the pre-processing basically includes some bandpass filtering, but also one important thing is a time alignment of the traces to correct for topographic and velocity variations in this approach. The blue rectangle now encompasses the source wavelet, and as you can just see from these two events, the source wavelet can vary drastically. So with the event from the Kuril Islands, it's actually a very sharp, very distinct event, but the source wavelet from the other event is not as clear. There's also a lot of structure going on in the wave field at later times, but unfortunately this structure in the wave field does not represent structure below the array, because it differs strongly from event to event. And performing a more detailed analysis, we actually found out that these strong amplitudes you see here arriving at later times are actually body waves, which are converted from the, surface waves, Rayleigh surface waves, which are converted from body waves from the teleseismic event. And this of course poses a challenge to the algorithm, because at these times where these body waves, where the surface waves arrive, and they represent coherent noise, I would also expect to see some classical reflections if they're there. So going in the end to results, I again applied both the blind deconvolution approach and the standard deconvolution. And again, the initial model for the reflectivity series below the array was 0 reflectivity. And these panels show the results for the reflectivity series below the array for all 3, or for the 2 methods. The most distinct, starting with the one to the left, which is the blind deconvolution without applying discontinuity constraints, I see a pronounced reflection in approximately 2 seconds, which is a small but significant rise in arrival times in the western part. And this feature gets somewhat smooth but also enforced regarding the amplitude if I apply the continuity constraints, which makes sense because I want to suppress the amount of noise. And the standard deconvolution provides a similar image regarding the shallow reflector, but the lower parts, the image at later times, it's more dominated by noise and not as easy to interpret. Finally, to validate these results I get here, I compare this to the known structure, or to the structure from previous investigations. There has been one study also applied to the Labache dataset, which uses arrival times from regional earthquakes to perform a travel time tomography, aiming again at a large scale velocity distribution below the array. And there are, of course, a lot of studies in the context of the active production, or the exploration of the production site. And from these studies, we know that the main feature in the shallow crust is one or actually two basement reflectors between 3.5 and approximately 5 kilometers depth, and also this low angle fault, which separates this high velocity, this thin layer of high velocity carbonates in the west from the other parts in the east. And if I take a 1D velocity model of the area and convert my image, which I get from the blind deconvolution to depth, this is what you see here. So the vertical axis is now depth in kilometers. So I can compare the previous results with my results, and actually find a quite reasonable correlation of the depths of the known reflectors with the result I get from a shallow reflector. I don't see I don't see directly an indication for the low angle fault at approximately 1 kilometer. But if I look in more detail, I can see a change in the reflectivity. So there seems to be some influence, but it's definitely not something I can interpret out of my image. Looking at deeper structures, there's also been another study by doing a PhD project, applying receiver functions to investigate the deep structure, and the MOHO, the mental crust boundary, was found in depth of approximately 40 kilometers, which again correlates quite good with a continuous reflector, which I might interpret in a deeper part. So coming to my conclusions, so I find this approach, using teleseismic events and applying this blind deconvolution approach, is, I think, well suited for local and large-scale subsurface imaging. Again, I want to emphasize, of course, this is in no way comparable to reflection seismology, but this may be useful to get some robust low-frequency solutions for shallow subsurface structure. Comparing it to standard deconvolution, it's much less sensitive, you can read it here, to white noise than conventional deconvolution. And again, this is basically to the fact that this blind deconvolution approach asks for a common model for all observation, which is not the case for the standard deconvolution and stacking. Regarding the data, so I use the same data subset like it's used for receiver function studies, so it's a supplement for the studies. The main difference is I only need one component. The results I've shown you have a vertical component, but this actually could also be applied to horizontal components looking at shear weights. And overall, I would say it's suitable for, but I also want to point out, during these studies, during this seismic experiment, they deployed, of course, the broadband station because it was in a more general setting. But looking at the frequency range of my data, so there's actually no need to have this costly and kind of heavy and difficulty to operate broadband stations. The frequency range, which is in the range from 0.5 to 2 Hertz, can be targeted by simply low-frequency geophones. And it's also applicable to any arbitrary array geometry. So it's not a 2D or 1D, well, in some cases it's 1D, but you can apply it to any array geometry. This is the end of my talk, and thanks.